So I'm going to talk tonight about the new edition of this book. The first edition was 1997. It was black and white. Black and white pictures were kind of muddy. The maps were line drawings that I did on a little Macintosh at 11 o'clock after my kids went to bed. And oh, can we cut the lights, please? And we were proud of it, but I'm much happier with this one. I think this is a great, I think that's okay, thanks. This is a fantastic update, and there are so many people to thank. I could spend 2 hours thanking them. Many of them are in this room. The White Mountain Research Station and staff are very important, but I'm going to focus on 4 people who are instrumental in bringing this book to fruition, and I'll try to keep that short. And the first person I would like to acknowledge is my wife, Mary Alney. We met at Pomona College in late 1974, and we took a camping trip to Death Valley 2 months later. And this, you can see it's the 70s by my bell-bottom jeans. And we had a fantastic time. Love affairs started then, and we've been going back ever since. Everything okay?
I think it's just they need to mute themselves when they come in.
Oh. Okay, so we come back as often as we can. 47 years we've been going to Death Valley. We were just there last month. It was fantastic. And so this book is dedicated to her. She's a brilliant person, very level-headed when I'm not. She's a physician, an outstanding physician, a great mother, and it's been a great person to go to Death Valley with over and over. And I hope you all have somebody like that that you can go.
How do I, is there a way to globally mute everybody?
I don't know.
Isn't there a way to do that?
Oh, I can just mute this, yeah.
There's a way to mute everybody who's in.
Let's try that. There we go. So the other person I'd like to thank is Art Sylvester, my co-author. This is Art and I in Death Valley last April. Art and I both went to Pomona College. We both went to UCLA. We both grew up in Southern California. And we got together, Art put together the revision of the very first Geology Underfoot book, which was a 1993 book. And we redid that a few years back, and he took the lead on that, and then I took the lead on redoing this one, and he's been great to work with. We've had such a good time working on this and critiquing each other's writing and everything, so it's really been great. The book covers Eastern California, Death Valley, some of the Mojave Desert, just for people driving up from Southern California, and it's divided into 3 main parts up here: Death Valley National Park, sort of this area, Bishop, Lone Pine, and so forth, and then up around Mammoth and Mono Lake. And we thought that was a good way to divide it up so people who were going to some of these places could figure out what they wanted to see. So I'm going to start with Death Valley. I'm going to show a lot of pictures. Most of these are from the book. And I should mention the book is divided into short chapters, vignettes, that are designed for you to go somewhere and get out of your car. Don't worry about it, Esther. It's just going to keep popping back up.
It's different people. I'm letting them in.
Yeah. So get out of your car. Some of them are designed for an hour, some for a day. You just pick someplace you want to go, but it's not roadside where you drive by and we talk about what you're driving past. This is go to a place and get out. So I'll be talking about some of that. So I'm going to very quickly show you a bunch of pictures of Death Valley, just to get a feel for how weird Death Valley is and the weird landscape and everything. So I'll just show a bunch. Very strange landscape. Mars. Someone noticed. Some of those were Mars. 5 of those were Mars. Death Valley has been used as a training ground for Mars and for Mars rovers and so forth. What about this one? Mars or Earth?
Earth.
Oh, okay. It's too, I should have reddened it a little bit. That would have been a lot harder. It looks very much like parts of Mars. These are the sand dunes. All good? Good. So the person who started the Geology Underfoot series was Bob Sharp. Bob Sharp was an incredibly accomplished and prominent professor at Caltech. He kind of helped invent planetary geology. He also wrote this book. This is the second edition, roadside, a field guide to Southern California, roadside guide. When I was a student, I would read from this while Mary drove, or she would read to me while I drove. And I learned so much about Southern California geology from this. And Bob's style is very engaging and funny at times, and really good for learning if you are coming in at a low level. And by kind of a miracle, I was a young assistant professor at the University of North Carolina in 1987, and I made contact with him, and he said, hey, would you like to start this new series where it's not a roadside guide, it's where people get out and look at stuff, which became the Geology Underfoot series. And he did that based on a guidebook that I had written when I was co-written when I was a student at UCLA. So he was 43 years older than me. This all happened by mail, pre-email. We were just mailing letters and things back and forth. We put out that first book, and then we put out the second book in 1997, which was the first edition of this book. Bob, so this is the cover of the first edition there with a painting of the racetrack. And you might know the Curiosity rover on Mars. It's been there for almost 10 years, climbing an 18,000 foot peak known as Mount Sharp, named after Bob Sharp. Its official name is Aeolus Mons, but everybody calls it Mount Sharp. And so in 10 years, it's made 17 miles. So they're taking it easy. There's a lot to see, a lot of sedimentary rocks. A lot of those pictures that I showed you that weren't Earth were Mars. Bob also has a glacier in Antarctica named after him, a crater on Mars, and an asteroid. So among the three of us authors, there are lots and lots of accolades and all, but they all go to Bob. So that's fun. He was a fantastic person. I feel so lucky to have gotten involved with him in this. So Bob's specialty was sand dunes and sand physics and so on. And so when the first orbital data from Mars came in back in the 70s, they saw lots of sand dunes. And so that's how he got involved. And he was an expert in the Death Valley dunes. So this is a short video. There's some wind sound. If we don't hear it, that's fine. But I was out there a couple of years ago on just a light breezy day. It was not windy at all. And if you get on the proper side of the dunes, you can see these curtains of sand coming across. And these are really interesting because the from the camera going perpendicular, normally it blows across the camera. I want you to work on your safety. Build up these beautiful ripples. If you go out there with a tripod and do some time lapse, I'm going to show you 9 minutes of time sped up by a factor of 20. And you can watch these ripples. You can also just put sticks in there and wait a while and you'll see the ripples march across. But if you have a tripod, you could do this kind of time lapse. It's really interesting. So sand dunes are very dynamic landforms. They move, the wind is blowing them all the time. And I thought, wow, I'm going to go back and find some historic photos of the dunes and see just how much they have changed. And much to my shock, they've hardly changed at all. So this is a 1982 air photo. The highest point in the dunes, if you have been climbed up there, which is where everybody heads first, is right here. And I'm going to show you a 2013 air photo. And the lighting, the shadows are different, but I'm going to just flip back and forth if I can here. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So don't be fooled by the shadows, but look at the dune crests. They're in the same places. That is so strange. I had no idea. Now, the mud flats are different. And there's vegetation, like this vegetation up here, I don't know if that particular stuff is mesquite or creosote, is kind of partially buried. This mud flat goes away. But those dunes are kind of cemented by rainwater and groundwater. So the basic structure of the dune stays put. The ripples move back and forth in the wind, but the dunes just stay put. So this kind of stuff, it's very impermanent, but when you look at the longer term picture, it's very permanent. So we have a short chapter in there on Natural Bridge. And we found an old photo of Natural Bridge from 1940. The photo on the right is from 1940. And the photo on the left is from a year ago. And when you look in the 1940 photo, there are rocks that look like they were going to fall out at any moment inside this arch. And everything is the same. They're all there. We could not find any difference. The only difference is that art is standing where there's a car in 1940. And I think this was pavement. That's different. But everything else is identical. There's a plaque at the start of the hike up Natural Bridge, which is a beautiful little hike that has what I think is an outlandishly crazy idea for how this formed. In the chapter, we explain how this actually formed. The thing in the park is, I don't know where that came from. It's insane. But anyway.
Didn't talk to you.
So there are lots of things in there that you think would disappear or be impermanent that really hang around for a long time. So if you drive south from Furnace Creek on the Badwater Road, right off on the left side of the road, on the east side, are these fault scarps. These are from earthquakes. This is alluvial fan, just a nice flat alluvial fan, sediment washed out of the mountains. And an earthquake broke this, and this is probably more than one earthquake. And to a geologist's eye, this looks like this happened yesterday or maybe this morning. I mean, these are very steep, and this is loose, unconsolidated stuff. There have been no significant earthquakes in Death Valley in historic time, let's say the last 150, 200 years.
Wow.
If you showed pictures of Death Valley, not Mars, but Death Valley, to people and said, how active is this? How often do you think they have big earthquakes and all? And people would say that's the most tectonically active place on the planet. But there's nothing. I'd say it's due, but it's partly because the rainfall is so short. So there are all these amazing features that normally in a place where it rained even 10 inches a year, this stuff would just get washed away within decades. And it's right there to see. Now, there are things that change very rapidly. And so we have a chapter, this is something Bob Sharp got onto a long time ago about the diversion of Furnace Creek Wash into a little drainage called Gower Gulch. So if you drive from the east, from Death Valley Junction, down Highway 190 into Death Valley, into Furnace Creek, sorry, you come down this long, wide wash, and then you make a really sharp 90-degree left-hand bend to come down into Furnace Creek. So Furnace Creek Settlement is down on the fan there, and this is the Furnace Creek Inn and employee housing. I have to remember that not everyone is in this room, so I will use the pointer. So this is employee housing. This is Furnace Creek Wash, this huge thing. And this is about a 90-degree left-hand bend to get around this turn. There used to be a gas station here a long time ago, a medical clinic. There's all sorts of infrastructure down here, and it regularly gets wiped out. The inn was built around 1933. There were some very heavy El Nino years, apparently, in the 30s. And so somebody got the bright idea that we can fix this if we just divert Furnace Creek. And so this is a Google Earth view. So we were just looking at this bend, and here's the Furnace Creek Inn, and so forth. Furnace Creek is a huge drainage. It comes down like this, and the highway follows it, goes past some springs and makes this bend. And there's a little gully called Gower Gulch. It runs like this and ends up right at Zabriskie Point. So if you've been to Zabriskie Point, you've been to Gower Gulch, basically. And there's only a very small divide between Gower Gulch, which drains this little area, and Furnace Creek over here. So they thought, hey, let's put a berm across Furnace Creek and dynamite the little low bridge and divert Furnace Creek into there. And so they did. And there were, I don't think they filed an environmental impact statement. There are all kinds of consequences of this, most of them negative, that were easy to predict if you had thought about it. Maybe the biggest one is the big floods don't care. They don't make this 90-degree turn. they come screaming down and wipe out stuff down here anyway, because they're not going to make a sharp turn like that. But it's a fascinating thing to look at. So if you go to Zabriskie Point, this is from the parking area, it's Zabriskie Point. Zabriskie Point is to the right. This is looking up Furnace Creek, kind of to the northeast. And the level before the diversion, the level of Furnace Creek wash was here. And everything down here has been eroded away since 1941, 1942. And this slot here is like you took a knife and cut it. It's about, we measured it last year, about 41 feet deep. It's just a very narrow slot canyon cut into this very soft stuff. So all this has been removed. 21 feet have been removed there. If you turned around and looked in the other direction, it's just flat. It's just a wash. It's just a big flat wash. That's where you park when you go to Zabriskie Point. But if you look upstream, it's an amazing amount of material has been removed, and this gully regularly bites out Highway 190. So they have to repair 190. They have huge rock cages, you know, to try to protect the highway and so forth. And if you go down on the fan where Gower Gulch ends up down in Death Valley, it regularly washes out the bad water road. And if you look in the sediments there, some of them are asphalt from Highway 190. So this has been kind of a mess. It continues to erode, and it's really remarkable. Here's that slot. Some of my students said, this is 2003. It's probably 5 feet deeper now. So it's a beautiful place to go. We talk about this in the book, obviously. So I really recommend that. Zabriskie Point is a great place as well. Now, my favorite place in Death Valley, if somebody said, I've got half a day, where should I go? I would send them to Mosaic Canyon. So I've been taking people to Mosaic Canyon for a long time. There is a lot to talk about in Mosaic Canyon. And I'm just going to mention one aspect of it. This is a field trip class I took there in 2009. And the students are walking down a gorge or a slot carved into the marble. It's beautiful marble, about 700 million years old, and it's full. It looks like it's bedded, but it's folded into these incredible isoclinal folds that go back and forth. So there's a big story there. But they're walking down this slot, and it's very beautiful and a little slick. You have to watch your step and all. And this is what it looked like last April. Those are identical views. It's filled up with about 6 feet of gravel. So here I've compared the two. So Samantha's head, the very top of her head would have been above the gravel. It's really hard to locate yourself when you go there because everything looks so different from these old photos. But I matched the view as carefully as I could. Now, there are no reports of giant flash flood kills hikers in Mosaic Canyon or anything, and there's no meteorological data from anywhere near there. So it's kind of hard to tell when these happen. But when I look at my photos going back, the level's up, the level's down, the level's up, the level's down. It's amazing. This would be a beautiful long-term study for somebody. I wish I had reoccupied the same space every time and taken the same photo every time I've been there over the last 47 years. But I haven't. So. And one thing, if you have a long time to go to Death Valley, you definitely want to try to get into the racetrack. Take my word for it, you should really make sure you can change the tires on it. Sometimes they put those lug nuts on real tight, you know, so you want to make sure you can do all of that, because I've had maybe 3 or 4 flats on my times going down there. Particular rock called Dolostone that weathers into these really sharp tire biters, and they just shred your tires. So the racetrack, of course, is famous for the tracks left by rocks, sliding rocks. And Bob Sharp investigated this at some length a long time ago. In long-term experiments, he did things like put rebar corrals around rocks, and he put a rebar corral around 2 rocks. Came back the next year, one of the rocks had moved out and left the track, and the other one was still there. That was confusing. But there are 2 main theories. One is that the playa gets wet, and then extreme winds, like 100-mile-an-hour winds, blow the rocks. The other is that the rocks are encased in a sheet of ice, and wind blows on the ice and carries the rocks. And part of the evidence for that is there are a lot of parallel tracks. So Bob's rebar experiment kind of said, well, if a rock got out of this corral, if it was frozen in ice, that doesn't make sense. So he was kind of against the ice idea. So a guy named Dick Norris here and his brother decided to instrument some rocks. They actually got a permit to instrument the rocks. They had to collect these rocks, same formation, but outside the park. They put GPS receivers in them, very high tech, and they put big nails in the playa. And the GPS receivers had a magnetic switch so that if they were blown off of the nail, the GPS would start recording, because everybody assumed that this all happened during extreme events when you wouldn't be able to see anything. You wouldn't be able to stand up, kind of what they had in Lone Pine last week. So Dick lent me these slides. He's a friend, and this is just such a fantastic story. They were out there in December of 2013. In the playa, it was a wet year, and it had snowed, and the playa had water on it and was frozen over. And the next day, they went out, and the ice was melting, and they walked around the north end of the playa, and they watched the ice melt and break up. It was fairly thin and break up, and it ended up being kind of a cool but nice day with a light breeze. And they walked all the way around the playa and came back to the south side. And by that time, the wind was blowing out of the south. We're looking north here. The wind was blowing out of the south, and it had blown the water away from the shore. And they saw this. So the rocks had moved while they were there. They were on the other end of the lake. And I've actually been, to the same place a few years later, and there are those same tracks in the dry mud. So they caught an event. These things happen infrequently, but they happened to be there when it happened. And even better, a few days later, they were out on the southeastern shore of the lake. And what you see here is rippled stuff, which is where the ice has melted away. And so this is all where the ice has melted, and the breeze, a moderate breeze, not a strong wind, was rippling the water. And the smooth areas are still ice, not rippling. And let's see, start this.
That's so.
Got to get it going. Whoop, wrong one. Back up. Come on. There. So Jim took a bunch of frames, and watch this rock. Looks like the Loch Ness monster. And there it goes. So these are still frames put together into an animation. So that sheet of ice, which was only millimeters thick, had that rock. It wasn't really lifting it. It's just that there was enough force from traction of the wind blowing on this big ice surface to move the rock. So if the whole lake's frozen over, nothing moves. If there's no ice, nothing moves. But when there's some ice and a decent wind, these things get blown. And so that's how you get the parallel tracks, because rocks are trapped in the same ice sheet. And the wind changes direction, and all the rocks make a turn and so forth. So they solved this problem. It's a fantastic study. I wish I'd been involved in it. So the next person I'd like to thank for all of this is Clem Nelson. Clem is a longtime friend of this station. Clem, here seen in a 1963 field trip up out of Big Pine there. In the upper right, he's there with Art Sylvester, my co-author, right there. John Christie, Gerhard Girdle, structural geologist from UCLA. There's Clem. And then in 1999, there's Clem, there's me, and there's Bruce Bilodeau, my office mate from UCLA, who wrote that guidebook with me that I sent to Bob Sharp that led to the Geology Underfoot series. So Clem lived in Bishop. He was quite a legend for lots of reasons. Great teacher, but geologically, he mapped 5 15-minute quadrangles up in the White Mountains, which is an area that's kind of like the San Francisco Bay Peninsula down to Gilroy, you know, I mean, it's a gigantic area at very high altitude, very detailed maps that were the basis for studies in all kinds of fields, including botany. The bristlecone pines, you know, grow on certain kinds of rocks preferentially and so forth. So he was really a fantastic person and introduced me via field trips to a lot of the geology around here. So I want to talk about a few things. By the way, this peak in 2012, Art Sylvester I started the paperwork, Art pushed it through. And we actually got this peak, which is right behind Schulman Grove. There's the visitor center right in there. Beautiful bristlecone festooned peak. Very interesting geologic story as to why there are no bristlecones here. And it's just a really great honor for him. This is Blanco Mountain in the background there for scale. What am I saying? Anyway. So one of the things Clem did for the science was he mapped and kind of popularized this area called the Polita Folds. This is the Westgard Pass Road heading down into Deep Springs Valley. There's Deep Springs College there. So just south of Westgard Pass, there are these crazily folded limestone layers. I mean, they just go every which way. And this is a training ground for geology students learning how to map and see the structure inside the earth. You walk around, you look at the attitudes of the rocks, you find faults where they're offset and all of that. And Art and I did a survey of schools that teach there. We came up with an estimate that since about the 1960s, there's probably been 10,000 students that have been trained there.
Wow.
Many of them stay here, or they'll stay up at the campgrounds up at Westgard Pass and so on. So it's really a great place. So we put in a chapter about a place on the very north end, right close to the road, that's easy to get to. We describe a little hike to go in and see this stuff. So here is a beautiful sequence of these layered limestones. There's blue limestone, there's some bleached blue, there's some buff limestone. This is all sandstone, there are fossils, there's all kinds of great things. And even better, there are folds. And there's a beautiful fold that you can see from the highway or from a short hike. And I don't know if it's obvious to you or not, but this is a syncline. It's a fold, a U-shaped fold where the layers have been folded. Kind of looks like that. And so this is part of this process of teaching novices to kind of see the three-dimensional structure and all. And there is no better place for doing this than Polita, which is why people come from all over the world to teach here. So Clem was very interested in the Bishop area, and I wanted to add a new vignette or two about Bishop in this one. And so I went out to the Buttermilks with Bob Harrington and Bill Albright and Art and Darla Heil and some other people. And I didn't know if there were big rocks out there. I didn't know if there was anything interesting to find or not. And we found something really interesting, I think. So this is Grandma Peabody. Huge highball problems. People can do these really long routes on steep rocks and an awful lot of very steeply overhanging stuff. So what is it? I forget the name. Evolute. Some of the really hardest bouldering problems there are on the backside of Grandpa Peabody here, where it's a 45-degree overhang, and it's insane what people can do. So we went out and looked around, and I did some photography. So I'm going to show you now is a panorama from up in the air. We're looking horizontally here. So there's Sherwin Crest, or Wheeler Crest, I mean. And I'm going to pan to where we're looking straight down. Let's see if this works. Let's see. So they're just big boulders, really big boulders, littering the landscape there. There are the Peabodys. The person went by for scale, but there are the Peabodys. Together, they make a boulder that's over 60 feet long and about 50 feet high. It's huge. A lot of these boulders have deep weathering pans in the top, and I'll get to that in a second. If you read the climbing literature, a lot of people say, well, these are glacial erratics. That's kind of an obvious interpretation. The only person I've read who didn't say that was Doug Robinson, who said, obviously they're not because they're all the same rock type. They're all this granite. very kind of run-of-the-mill granite, very recognizable, but every boulder looks like that. And if you look to the west where the glaciers came from, so here's Bob Harrington climbing a green wall boulder. So there's Mount Tom in the background. And you notice Mount Tom is varicolored. Lots of different rock types in there. There's some granite, but there's a lot of very dark gabbro. There's a lot of metamorphic rocks, orange and brown metavolcanic rocks. And if you could look behind this boulder, you'd see Mount Humphreys, and there's a lot of that stuff there. That's where the glaciers were coming from. And if these are glacial erratics, they would be those kinds of boulders. And they're not. They're all the same granite. So we went up there 2 or 3 times and looked around. These weathering pits are big and they're very interesting. And if you go to the intact bedrock at the top of the hill, there are all these big weathering pits in them. Shallow ones on the sides, big deep ones on the top. This boulder, which I don't think has a name, has some really deep ones, and some are even I can get into there. But a really interesting thing is that on a lot of the boulders, the weathering pits are on the bottom, which is odd because they form by water getting into flat surfaces and freezing and breaking the rock apart by freeze thaw, and they expand these things. So this is Darla looking at the bottom of a boulder there. And then here's Cecil Patrick looking under a boulder. An awful lot of these boulders have smooth undersides, and you can see from one side to the other. If you go to the Alabama Hills, it's not like that. Those are largely core stones that are just weathering out in place, and they have solid bases. But an awful lot of these boulders in the Peabody area have these smooth undersides. And what I started noticing, and you can't really see it in this photo, but there's a lot of dark material that's kind of smeared out parallel to the surface of these boulders in this crudded up material underneath. So I took a piece of that, made a thin section for a microscope and looked at it, and it is smashed granite.
Whoa.
So this is a thin section view, and if you've ever seen a granite in thin section, this is a granite, but all the crystals are broken on the micro scale. Exactly what would happen when you have a rock fall. And these boulders come down, these gigaton, well, that's exaggeration. These really big boulders come down and skid to a stop on the rock underneath. So I think it's pretty clear that these are rock slide boulders. And the reason you have weathering pans that should be on top, on the bottom, and on the side sometimes is because they tumble down. And the ones that have weathering pans on the bottom typically have new ones forming on the top and all. So my speculation is these things fall in big earthquakes. I wouldn't doubt that some of these came down in the 1872 earthquake. And if we could date when they came down, there are ways for doing that. We might be able to get an idea for when big earthquakes shake these things loose. Last person I'd like to acknowledge in this is Steve Lipschen. Steve was a graduate student at UCLA when I started in 1976. He delayed getting his PhD for something like 17 years by writing guidebooks. And he wrote a fantastic guidebook to the Long Valley Mammoth area and took 80 people from UCLA on a field trip there in the fall of 76 when I started. And it was my first time up here. And my eyes were open to all the fantastic geology around the Long Valley caldera. Steve has written 2 more editions of this. This is the 3rd edition. It's available from the Geological Society of Nevada. There's a website there. I would get one if you're interested at all. It's beautifully written, comprehensive. It has stops everywhere. And it's really a fantastic resource. So if you're interested at all in the volcanism and glacial geology up there, get a copy of this thing. It's kind of hard to believe, but not that long ago, say 15,000 years ago, this is what the east side would have looked like. This is the Southern Alps in New Zealand, but this is, I talked to Greg Stock, the geologist at Yosemite, and we kind of thought this might be what Pine Creek looked like, or Caboose Pass or something. When at the last glacial maximum, or when the glaciers were kind of melting back and retreating, and you've got hanging glaciers in these valleys and ice falls, and this could be Levining Canyon, and this could be up around Tioga Pass. This is kind of what it looked like out there. Go out there when it's 100 degrees and look up there and try to imagine that this is what it looked like not that long ago. There were people in North America and maybe here at that time. Those glaciers leave big moraines, and you all are familiar with that, I think. Pine Creek has beautiful moraines coming out into the valley floor. This is McGee Creek up by Crowley, and these big moraines. There are moraines of different ages here coming down. So this would have been filled with ice 15, 20,000 years ago, but this one has an extra added bonus, which it has this gigantic fault scarp. This fault scarp is 50 feet tall. And it's in a 20,000-year-old roughly moraine. So it's been moving at about a millimeter a year average, which is a lot. It broke a little bit in one of the 1980 earthquakes, but not very much. But this is a way to get it by faults cutting features of known age. You can sort of get an idea of fault slip and all. And this is really easy to see. You can drive right up to it. A really interesting tie-in with the first book is that this is a color version of a photo from the 1997 book. Here's the campground. There's the road, which makes a big bend to get around this fault scarp. But see this boulder here? It's a magnitude 5.3 earthquake in 1998, and that boulder ended up in the back of that campsite. And according to reliable sources, that campsite was occupied. It happened in the middle of the night, and they got up the next morning and said, there's a big rock. So I don't think that was there yesterday. So it's kind of interesting, that rock, it's granite, it formed somewhere, it eventually made it to the surface, it got eroded, it got carried, it fell onto the glacial ice, got carried down, got dumped when the glacial ice melted, hidden from the sun, got exposed by faulting on this thing, and then another earthquake dropped it down into the campground, and who knows what'll happen in the next 20,000 years. So that's kind of a little interesting thing. So this is my former student, Roger Putnam, climbing in Owens Gorge. And last April, I was actually doing some research in there, and I asked some climbers that were going by about what they're climbing in, and nobody I talked to knew anything about what they were climbing in the gorge. So I wrote a beefed up chapter on the Bishop Tuff. And I'd like to remind people that the Bishop Tuff was erupted about 760,000 years ago. That was during a time period called the Irvingtonian. And this was a time of megafauna. There were mammoths, saber-toothed cats, flat-faced bears that were 6 feet tall at the shoulder. They were really big. Sloths, horse relatives, camels, all these things were up there. There's no real fossil record of these things that I'm aware of, but during this time, that's what would have been there, living in this pastoral Long Valley area. There was an ancestral Owens River there. There were some volcanoes, and they would burp out white ash every once in a while and blanket the countryside, but life was pretty good until 767,000 years ago, when the volcanism picked up, and then there was a colossal super eruption that produced a Long Valley caldera. This is a morning flight out of Fresno, and out the left window, I got this beautiful view of the caldera. So Mammoth Lakes is just off the left, or Mammoth Lakes is here. Mammoth Mountain is just off the left, and this topographic scarp, which you drive up on 395 very obviously, is the northern rim of the caldera and the eastern rim, and then the topography is kind of suppressed down around Lake Crowley. But this is a collapse feature from the eruption of about 600 cubic kilometers of magma in about a week, according to the studies that happened. That is, well, at least 5 times larger than the largest historic eruption, and would be a pretty serious event for that to happen today. Here's Mono Lake in the background. And if you take that 600 kilometers and piled it on Mono Lake, it would be 600 cubic kilometers. It would be 2 miles deep. So that's a sort of an idea of the volume of stuff that came out. A lot of it it was confined between the White Mountains and the Sierra Nevada. So a lot of it came south and makes the volcanic tableland north of us. So here's a view looking north. The caldera rim is up here, and this is the gorge there and the aqueduct and so forth. So there's a lot of climbing that goes up in there in this tuff, which is the very tangible evidence of this super eruption. And if you've been down in the gorge at the powerhouse, I forget which powerhouse it is, you see beautiful columnar joining. These sort of tulip-shaped or rosette columnar joints are from where steam vents were escaping from this, because the tuff blanketed whatever was there. The Owens River, there might have been ice there, marshlands, animals, plants, and everything, and all of that stuff turned to steam and carbon dioxide and had to make its way through this to the surface through this gigantic thick pile. Bishop Tuff ash is recognized in sediments as far east as Nebraska. And Yellowstone has had 3 really big eruptions, and some of those ashes are exposed over even larger areas. Unlike, let's say, Mount St. Helens, which was kind of pipsqueak by the scale, it's about 1 cubic kilometer, not 600. And Yellowstone's more like 1,000. The winds carried that east, and it covered Yakima and everything. A pretty obvious control of the prevailing winds. But these things are so big, and they get so far into the stratosphere and so on, that they don't care about the winds. They make their own weather. So they make these much larger plumes here. And one chapter in the book is about the Dakota lake beds down near Shoshone. And if you go there, you can see these little dwellings that people carved into this 6 or 8 foot tall ash layer. This is one of the Yellowstone ashes.
Wow.
6 feet deep.
Wow.
700 miles away, maybe 6 feet deep. Dakota. Now, it might be thickened a little from what fell, but these are big eruptions. So they were studying to try to find out if they're going to happen again. So I'm going to finish up talking just for a second about the monocraters and iniocraters. So you might recognize this as Panem crater. Mono Lake is just behind me here, and you have this nice arcuate set of rhyolite domes. It's really thick, pasty lava that comes out, and they initially blow out a lot of debris, a lot of pyroclastic debris, pumice and so on, and make a big ring of that. And then at Panem, the pasty lava came up very slowly and partially filled that ring. And then these other monocraters, they've totally obliterated the ring and run over it. And if you go farther south toward Mammoth, you can see places where the magma just came up and hit the water table and made big steam eruptions. That's the iniocraters, but no magma came out. If you go closer to Mammoth, you just find a big crack, the earthquake fault ahead of that rising magma, but no magma came out. And that goes right into Mammoth Lakes. And a really interesting thing about this is that this dome right here, this is Obsidian Dome on the right. And this is Glass Creek Dome or flow, which drapes over the edge of the caldera. So we're looking west here. That's Ritter and Banner back there. This is White Wing Mountain. And Connie Millar is sitting up front here. Did a really interesting dendrochronology study of trees that were killed by the eruption of this. They determined that it happened in medieval times. As a matter of fact, I want to read you a little bit of prose from the book about this chapter. It was late summer of the year 1350. The 100 Years' War between France and England was underway. The Black Death was ravaging Europe. Tenochtitlan, future capital of the Aztec Empire, was newly founded on an island in the lake that would become Mexico City. The Mongol Empire was breaking up. Dante's Divine Comedy was on the bestseller list. And volcanoes in Eastern California, just a few miles north of the future ski town of Mammoth Lakes, were blasting the countryside with ash and spreading pasty lava over the United Forest. In Connie's work, they showed not only what year that happened, but what season.
Oh, wow.
It's amazing. We should talk to her about it. So that was 1350, fairly recent. It's not the most recent eruption in this area. That would go to this volcano on Paoha Island in Mono Lake, which erupted around the year 1700. So there's a lot of volcanic activity in this area. It's currently quiet, but it's certainly, there's lots of potential for future volcanic activity. So we go back up into space and look at this part of the world from the space station. Here's the Sierra Nevada, Mono Lake, Lone Pine, Bishop, the White Mountains, Inyo Range, and so forth, the Basin Range. Here's Death Valley, the racetrack, and so on. There is an incredible variety of geology here. This is the best place in the world to study geology. That's why people come from all over the world and send their students from all over the world, because you've got everything. You've got the transition from the pre-Cambrian to the Cambrian, and suddenly there's all sorts of fossil evidence for life, trilobites and that sort of thing. That was what Clem Nelson worked on right up here. You have all this active volcanism. You have this evidence for really rapid climate change. There's all sorts of hydrological issues. There's botanical, geological issues like the bristlecone pines. There's everything. People I talked about in here sort of set the stage for the work that a lot of us do, but you can just, especially if you live in Bishop, you can just go out in any direction and see amazing things. So I hope you'll visit some of the things in this book. I hope you'll get Steve Lipsky's book and visit in a little more depth. And enjoy your time here in the geologic center of the world, as far as I'm concerned. So be happy to answer any questions, and thank you very much.